Hi, good afternoon, everybody. We're going to get started. I want to thank you for coming here on this rainy day. My name is Deborah Gonzalez. I'm the Government Affairs Director here at Public Policy Institute of California, or PPIC. This kind of rainy day makes my water team really happy. I know it made it hard for you all to get here, but those are some happy campers over there. They watch it every day. For those of you who are not familiar with PPIC, we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank with offices both in Sacramento and San Francisco. For today's presentation, we're going to hear from PPI researcher Caroline Danielson, who will present findings from a new PPIC report on reducing child poverty in California. Caroline's co-author, Sarah Bone, is here today as well. You should have found a copy of the report on your chair, as well as two fact sheets, one on child poverty and one on poverty generally in California. We're bringing them down to 2 pages. It's something I advocate as a legislative staffer for those who need quick facts, and those can also be found on our website. So I hope you find those helpful. We'd like to thank the LA Partnership for Early Childhood Investment and Sunlight Giving for their support of this research. We'd also like to thank the PPIC Corporate Circle and PPIC Donor Circle for helping make this event possible, the beer bread and the lovely salad, for the lunch today. So the full report along with the slides are available online now at ppic.org. Caroline will also tell you about a new line interactive tool also found on ppic.org, which will allow you to explore how policy changes could affect child poverty in your own county. I want to thank Vicki and the communication team. This is a really heavy lift for our communication staff, and I just appreciate it, and we all appreciate the extra work that they put into this and this new tool. After the presentation, you'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. A few more things. In November 28th, in the same room, we will have an event by the Higher Ed Policy Center team about improving college pathways in California. This event will include presentations and a panel of experts who will talk about promising approaches for effective pathways to a college degree. Please sign up online if you'd like to attend or watch that event. Later today, you'll receive a survey. That's what we do, surveys. And we really do look at those surveys. We get feedback, so we would appreciate your comments on that. And the thing we get comments on most is if we ever get rid of the beer bread. It's crazy. It's crazy. I could say anything, but if it's the beer bread, it's gone. So finally, please turn off your cell phones. California is a state of great riches, both in our environment, but also in the number of high-income people in the state. The California economy, if it were a nation, and Chris, you and I always used to go about this, is it the 5th biggest economy or the 6th biggest economy in the world? It's a significant economy. But underlying this incredible level of success, there are growing numbers of people who are struggling to make ends meet. This is something that is really, we're starting to hear a lot about even from the statewide candidates for governor. We've been doing a series of events. You could also see those online with the various governor's candidates. And they've been talking about the two Californias, the idea that there are successful Californians and those who are struggling with poverty. This report identifies the complexity of the issue across the state because we have 58 counties, 482 cities, each facing different challenges. Boiled down to its essence, the report finds that most children in poverty have parents who are working but struggling to make ends meet. For some children, it's because their families lived in high-cost areas. For others, it's the lack of available full-time jobs or high-wage jobs that meets a family's needs. For policymakers who spent last year focused on the housing crisis, there's some important information in the report about the high cost of housing and how it contributes to poverty. The report does go on to say that reducing the income gap or the availability of affordable or providing affordable housing would really impact child poverty between 1.6 to 2.8% statewide. And while you may not think that's a significant number, it really is if you realize that CalFresh reduces poverty rate by 2.3% and the federal ETIC by 2.2%. So housing is a worthy effort to be involved in. But the complexity and depth of poverty in the state cannot be fixed by addressing the housing crisis alone. This report attempts to look at policy choices and their trade-offs so that policymakers understand the impacts of their policy decision. This is particularly important in the light of the fact that the state is facing the 7th year, or almost 8th year, of an economic expansion, and at some point that ends. And as a former budget staffer, that brings shivers to my mind and some serious concerns about what the state does if we have a significant economic downturn. And so this is an important tool. This report is an important tool. There's some of the proposals here have an extreme cost, high costs, and that's important for us to recognize that these choices sometimes cost money. The housing situation, resolving the housing situation may or may not cost money, but some of the other things outlined in this report may cost money. But let's remember that by reducing child poverty, you may avoid some other expensive costs in the future, so it's a worthy endeavor for us to consider. Sorry, I just need coffee today. I think I'm stuttering a little bit. I'd now like to introduce Caroline Danielson. She's a senior fellow at PPIC whose research focuses on multiple dimensions of social safety net, including its role in mitigating poverty, program access and enrollment, and the integration and governance of program. Thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks everyone for coming today. Before I get started on this research, which really builds on a line of inquiry that we've been working on for several years now that centers on the California poverty measure, let me underscore that my co-author, Sarah Bone, is here, as well as Tess Thorman, who worked on many aspects of this research. Call out our summer intern, Alvin Tang, who really contributed over the June to August period, and Sarah Kimberlin, who's our co-conspirator in the California Poverty Measure research, generally gave us some great insight into early stages of this research. And of course, the online interactive, the data visualization that I'm going to introduce you to at the end of my presentation would not at all have happened without contributions of Vicki Shea, as Deborah mentioned, so many thanks to her as well. And we're, of course, grateful for the support from our funders that made this research really possible. So California has a high poverty rate. When you take the cost of living into account, we actually, according to the Census Supplemental Poverty Measure, have the highest poverty rate in the nation. And we haven't actually returned to the last low that we saw, the last poverty low that we saw just before the Great Recession in 2007. We're still higher than that. And we know that particularly in early years, children's living in poverty, having adverse economic circumstances can have long-term effects. And so it's a matter of particular concern that we have a high poverty rate. And we know also from some of the research into the California Poverty Measure that we've done over the past number of years that high housing costs and low wages contribute to child poverty. And so we acknowledge that we recognize that state lawmakers have taken significant recent actions to address some of these challenges, including the package of bills signed by the governor this fall to boost, that represents an effort to boost housing supply in the state and to fill some of the deficit in housing that we have. Also, minimum wage increases that the first one took effect in January 2017 to $10.50 an hour, and we expect to have a minimum wage if the plan is followed of $15 an hour in 2022. And finally, the Cal EITC, which builds on the federal earned income tax credit and provides a boost to families with low and moderate earnings at tax time. We instituted the Cal EITC in 2015 and then expanded it in 2017. So policymakers have certainly taken action. And our previous research in our previous research, we've spent time to understand the prevalence of poverty and to build into it the challenge of high housing costs and the role of the existing social safety net, including the EITC. And in doing that research, which is joint with the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality, we've noted the key role of social safety net programs. We've tracked poverty over the period 2011 to 2015, and we've looked at poverty as it varies across the state by county, most recently by legislative district, including state assembly, state senate, and congressional district. And today, what we're doing, what this research does, is to delve deeper into the California Poverty Measure and to examine what California's poverty rate, and particularly for young children ages 0 to 5 what the poverty rate could have looked like in the recent past, since we don't have a crystal ball and can't peer exactly into the future. If we had some of these policies in place, some of the policies that lawmakers have already put in place, like the minimum wage, but also some potential other policies, targeted expansions to the social safety net, what would poverty look like and what would the related metrics look like? How would economic need have changed in California in order to inform discussions around how we might approach reducing child poverty in California? And we have an online interactive, which we've mentioned a few times, and I will definitely be giving you a sneak peek in a few minutes. So today, let me talk a little bit about these barriers of high housing costs, a little bit more detail of low-wage jobs and high housing costs. Then talk about these broad-based policy approaches to reducing child poverty that center on reducing housing costs, increasing the minimum wage, and then examine some potential targeted expansions to the social safety net that can help frame discussions about how we might further address the problem of child poverty in the state. I'll close with some considerations and trade-offs for policymakers, and then spend a little bit of time giving you a taste of our data visualization. So California is a high-cost state. How does this vary across the state? Our lowest-cost county, according to the California poverty measure, is Tulare, and its poverty line for a family of 4 is just slightly under the federal poverty line of about $24,000 a year. Our mid-cost county is Riverside, and that poverty line is about 20% higher than the federal poverty line would lead you to believe. And San Francisco is the highest cost county in the state, and that poverty line is over 50% higher than the federal poverty line. So there are dramatic differences across the state, and in general, California is simply just more costly than the federal poverty line would lead us to expect. In our research, in our report, and what I'll be presenting today, we group counties into high, medium, and low cost in order to provide some more insight into differences across the state. And Tulare, Riverside, and San Francisco are representative of those parts of the state. Statewide, among families with young children, reported annual housing costs in the middle, at the median, are $12,300. This varies substantially across the state. In low-cost counties, it's reported to be $8,000, and in high-cost counties, it's nearly $14,000. This variation is actually greater among poor families across low, middle, and high-cost counties than it is for poor Californians compared to all Californians, where housing costs are only about 20% lower than for all Californians. These housing costs translate into housing burden, and here we're looking at severe housing burden, which is paying more than half of your resources towards your housing. And statewide, among poor families with young children, nearly a third, 31%, have severe housing burden by this definition. There's some important variation that's linked to the housing costs, variation in housing costs across the state, so it's a little bit under a quarter in low-cost counties, but a little bit over a third in high-cost counties. So housing is a challenge in California. Low-wage jobs are also a challenge. Looking at the share of adults in families with young children who are employed, it doesn't vary very much across the state. What does vary substantially is whether you have a full-time year-round job. It's 37% among adults in families with young children, but that varies from about 1/5 in low-cost counties up to 2/5, double in high-cost counties. So having full-time year-round work. Similarly, being employed in a low-wage job is prevalent among low-income adults, but it's especially high in low-cost counties. So there's more employment challenges that low-cost counties face than higher-cost counties, where employment opportunities are more robust. So with these challenges in mind, how would we expect poverty to change, and how do we project poverty would change in the state if housing costs were more in line with costs in the rest of the country? So we frame two scenarios here. One is to bring housing costs in California to the 90th percentile in the rest of the country, and the second is so California's would be in the top 10% of instead of in the stratosphere in terms of housing costs. And the second is the 75th percentile, so bringing it down to the top quarter. And to give you some context, the 90th percentile for a large urban area in the rest of the country is New York and Long Island, and a 75th percentile large urban area is Miami, Fort Lauderdale. So looking at the result, we see a 1.6 percentage point lowering of poverty, so a reduction in poverty statewide for the 90th percentile scenario, and a 2.8 percentage point reduction in the 75th percentile scenario. To put this in context, Deborah mentioned other existing safety net programs. This is for the larger scenario, especially focusing on high-cost counties where most of the effect is seen. This is a little bit under the effect of CalFresh and EITC for young children. Those come in at a little between 4.2 to 4.8 percentage point reduction in poverty. If we zero out those programs, there would be many more children in poverty. So this is on par, the 75th percentile scenario, with those existing safety net programs in high-cost counties. And the 90th percentile scenario is on par with the CalWorks program, and in terms of its ability to reduce poverty in California. But you'll see that these effects are extremely concentrated in the high-cost parts of the state. In fact, for the 90th percentile scenario, there is simply no change in child poverty as a result of reducing housing costs because their housing costs are already below the 90th percentile, and there's very small change for the 75th percentile scenario. Turning to minimum wages, the $13, we consider both the $13 minimum wage and the $15 minimum wage scenario. And what we're showing are results where there is no job loss or employment hours reductions as a result of the minimum wage increases. If you take a look at our online technical appendices, you'll find a lot more information about other additional scenarios that we've looked at in terms of the minimum wages and all of the scenarios that I'm discussing today. So the statewide results for these two increases of the minimum wage that we project are roughly the same as for housing costs statewide, but they're much more widely shared across the state. They tend to be larger in the high-cost parts of the state, but clearly there's some reductions in both the low-cost counties and the mid-cost counties. So these are both broad-based policies. Housing scenarios affect essentially everyone in high-cost counties, and they affect no one or nearly no one in lower and mid-cost counties. The minimum wage affects many who are not poor and many who do not have children. So they're very broad-based policies that affect large swaths of the California population. They're not particularly targeted at children or at children in poverty. They also tend to, although I didn't show it in the slides, they tend to lower poverty more than deep poverty, so they tend to be effective for children who are not as in absolutely dire circumstances. So deep poverty is having resources that are less than half of the poverty line. And these policies tend to move children who are closer to the poverty line above poverty rather than moving children out of deep poverty. So in our research, we went on to consider some targeted expansion to the social safety net programs. And here we really rely on the infrastructure of the California poverty measure to add to the programs that we consider already in calculating poverty in California. So not only do we include families' cash resources in the California poverty measure, we also add in cash assistance programs like CalWorks, but also nutrition assistance programs like CalFresh, tax credit programs like the EITC, and housing assistance. And this is a broader scope of resources that families may have available to them to help them make ends meet. And without these programs, these current existing programs, we estimate that an additional 15.5% of children would be in poverty. So we have young children. So we have about 700,000 young children in poverty in California by our estimates. And if we didn't have this social safety net, this existing social safety net, we estimate that we would have about 475,000 more children in poverty without these programs. But there are some limitations. We still have a high child poverty rate. And in part, this may be because of some key gaps in the social safety net, including that many of our programs are work-based. And here, a key example is the EITC. The Cal EITC, like the federal EITC, requires earned income, and it promotes work, it incentivizes work, which is a good thing. At the same time, for families that face barriers to employment, whether their own barriers because of lack of work preparation or some other kind of challenge that they may encounter, or because of job opportunities in their area, or perhaps because of a recession, they may be out of luck in terms of accessing some key parts of the social safety net. So we examined some policies that wouldn't be contingent on work. Another potential limitation of the safety net as it exists in California is that many programs are pegged to a federal poverty line, and you've already seen that California's poverty line is much higher in most parts of the state than the federal poverty line. So there may be places where working poor are not eligible or not fully eligible for federally based programs because they make too much, but they're still in poverty because of the high cost of living in California. So we examined two different varieties of safety net programs that could reach more of the lowest income and that could reach more of the low and moderate income Californians. And we built these on the Cal EITC, a policy that lawmakers have clearly paid attention to in the past several years in California. And in particular, we consider a couple of ways of expanding the Cal EITC to include more low-wage workers. We also consider adding a child credit to California's roster of programs, and this would be contingent on having lower moderate income, but not necessarily earnings, and having children. And finally, given the concerns about housing burden in the state, we considered restructuring the current small and non-refundable renters credit to include only those who are facing severe rent burden and who are low and moderate income. So in one way or another, all of these options build on the state EITC that in its original form in 2015 really did focus on the very lowest income Californians, and in the 2017 expansion began to add some dollars for those who were near a minimum full-time minimum wage job, so that we consider both of these potential gaps in the safety net in our expansions, our projected or potential expansions of social safety net programs. So again, returning to the poverty lens as a way of assessing the effectiveness of these policy scenarios and looking first at the policies that we frame, the policies we simulate that are aimed at the lowest income families. First, there's the expansion of the Cal EITC that gives a bigger boost to those who are lowest income and working. And the second is the child credit that doesn't make that boost contingent on having earnings. And then finally, there's the renter's credit that relieves severe rent burden for the subset of low-income poor with children who face that. And we see that these approaches have similar effects for those in deep poverty as for in poverty. And because there's only about 5% of young children in poverty, this means that on a percentage basis, they're having a bigger effect in the deep part of the income spectrum where children are in deep poverty. The second set of scenarios that focuses more on low and moderate income families with children in poverty, potentially in poverty, has a bigger effect on the poverty rate, not surprisingly, because we're moving higher up into the income spectrum. And for example, for the EITC, making the full federal plus Cal EITC available to a higher range of folks who may still be in poverty because of the high cost of living, but who are in the kind of sloping downward phase of the EITC. We also simulate a more child credit that would reach higher up into the income spectrum, and a renter's credit that, again, is not limited to those who are higher up in the income spectrum, but is scaled so that it can reach those who are somewhat higher up in the income spectrum who are also rent burdened. And what we find is that these effects are larger on the poverty rate than the deep poverty rate, not surprisingly. We also find, although not shown here, that the effects for high-cost counties tend to be larger than for low-cost counties for the EITC. But the reverse is true for the child credit, where the effects tend to be larger in low-cost counties and somewhat smaller in high-cost counties. Across the board, renters' credits is roughly the same across counties, low, mid, and high-cost counties in this state. What does also stand out is that a child credit, simply making a credit available to families who have children, has the largest poverty effects. And this is even true of the child credit that was aimed at the lower part of the income spectrum that I just discussed. But there's other considerations besides poverty rate change that policymakers would likely want to take into consideration, including the total cost. And here we're framing some possibilities that can help fill gaps in the safety net and attack different issues that families might face when they're in poverty. So the details, of course, would and could vary widely in practice. But as we frame them, these policies range from about $417 million to $5.62 billion. Now, on the low end of the scale, that's the expansion of the Cal EITC for the lowest income, and the high end of the scale, that's the large-scale expansion of or the large-scale creation of a child credit. The number of children assisted also ranges widely. So this is young children. 210,000 for the smaller renters credit to 1.59 million for the broader child credit. And the EITC, in terms of dollar amounts, provides somewhat smaller amounts to families, representative amounts to families, while the child and renters credits provide somewhat larger amounts to representative families. So these issues of scale and scope and depth of the policies are also critical considerations for policymakers. And again, overall, child credits cost the most, but they also assist the most children. They provide among the largest benefits, and they also reduce poverty by the largest amount. So these are widely differing policies in terms of their scale and scope. But it's interesting to put them on some kind of similar metric. And what we chose to do in this report is to provide an assessment of how many children estimated to be moved out of deep poverty and out of poverty per $1 million spent. So how many are moved above those poverty lines? If we do this per dollar basis, we see some commonalities. The EITC and child credits at the low income side of the spectrum, the lowest income side of the spectrum, are actually quite similar and quite effective in moving children out of deep poverty and poverty. And renters credits, although they look smaller in their poverty effect and they assist fewer children, they're also, by this metric, quite effective. EITC and child credits that are targeting the higher end of the income spectrum are less effective because they're assisting more children who are not in poverty to begin with, but are getting a boost from the credit nonetheless. So this is yet another way in which that we can put these policies, or try to put these policies in perspective and examine or think about some of the trade-offs. And this is, I think, for us, not because we have the answer, but because they're important considerations. So California faces some key long-term challenges, and policymakers have taken action around high housing costs and low wages. There's additional options that are challenging because of potential budget outlays that could be quite large in an uncertain federal environment with a potential recession around the corner. But there's also, even if we undertook these challenges, there's key questions that remain about where to target investments. Do we care most about deep poverty? Do we want to assist the broadest swath of children who are in need? Do we want to get the most bang for our buck in terms of moving people above some poverty line, whether it be deep poverty or poverty? And those are critical questions to consider before framing any one of these policies as the right one to take on. Additional considerations include an additional key consideration includes the variation across the state and the variation in need across the state in terms of where housing is particularly high or where employment opportunities are particularly challenging. So in service of giving you a little bit more insight or whetting your appetite for looking at some of the differences across the state, let me turn now to a little bit of an introduction to our online interactive which you can find by going to the report page on our website, and there's a couple places there to click and link to our online interactive. And what you see, if you go there, is a map of California's 58 counties. Because of our data, public use American Community Survey data, we can only identify 38 individual counties. We combine, out of necessity, the 20 smallest counties into 3 groups. But you see a map of California showing the projected poverty rate under each of the policy scenarios that we consider, and where you land is the $13 minimum wage. And what you see also is some information in the middle in the ring charts about how many, what share of children are assisted by their status in the income spectrum. So whether they're in deep poverty, under half the poverty line, whether they're in less severe poverty, but still in poverty, whether they're just above poverty, or whether they even be above that. And so we're at the $13 per hour minimum wage scenario. Up at the top, you have, you can click on any one of these tabs and see the housing scenario, the EITC scenarios, the child credit scenarios, and the renter's credit scenarios. And you can select any one of the counties. The bar chart that's a little bit below allows you to see the ranking of counties, and here we're in the statewide view, so here's where the state falls in the rank of counties. And if you select any one of the bars, you'll zoom into one of the counties on the map as well and get a little bit more information about the counties. And even below that, there's some information about numbers of children in poverty under our baseline scenario and under the projected change, as well as information about the percent of children assisted in poverty and in deep poverty, and an assessment of the dollar increase in resources for a representative dollar amount for individual families, as well as a total dollar amount projected for young children and for, in the bottom right-hand corner, for the population as a whole. So if we go back to the minimum wage scenario, which is where you land in the first place, we see the statewide projected 1.3 percentage point decline, and that we're assisting statewide about 11% of children in deep poverty, but 35% of children who are in less severe poverty. If we move over to the child credit, about the same percentage point reduction in child poverty, but we're assisting many more children in deep poverty with this child credit. And if we go to the largest one, the one that has the largest effect, we're assisting almost all children in deep poverty and in less severe poverty, and a large majority of children who are above poverty, but within 1.5 times the poverty line. The county that has the largest effect in terms of the change in poverty rate is Monterey and San Benito combined. And so in this broader child credit scenario, although the statewide change is 4.4 points, the change for this county group is 7.4 points in the broader scenario. And so that puts them at the top of the list. And of course, there's a margin of error associated with all of these scenarios, and we provide more information about that in our online technical appendices. Turning back to the lowest income scenario, just to close, Monterey and San Benito actually it benefits the most under our projections from the broader child credit, but is one of the smaller, has one of the smaller changes under the low income credit. So there's some notable differences both within the policies, across the policies, and across different parts of the state. So it's, we hope, worth your while to take a closer look and see, assess for yourself some of the trade-offs across the policies that we framed in this report, and learn more about the part of the state that you're most interested in. So with that, let me return to our report and ask if there are any questions. We do have microphones around the room, so if you could wait for a microphone to come to you, then sure. That'd be great.
Caroline, curious as to whether or not you guys looked at or considered looking at what any sort of training for higher wage jobs would have done to the poverty rates, and also curious as to whether or not you were surprised at the amount of effect any of these policies had on the overall poverty rate.
Sarah's probably a better person to answer some of this.
So I would say, not specifically, we didn't model that, but what we specifically looked at was increases in wages on the order of 12 to 20% for low wage workers. So, that could come from a minimum wage, but it could come from training or something that could increase wages to that level. So I'd like to think of them general in that sense. But we certainly, when weighing the trade-offs of these different kind of approaches, thinking of like long-term economic mobility, you might be better off investing in training in some ways for certain subsets of the workforce.
We focused on sort of short-term, although clearly changing housing costs is not a short-term challenge, but and some minimum wage is slated to increase over a number of years. But we're focused on sort of economic need in the short run. But education and training is an important piece of the puzzle. You asked me about surprising. Yes. I would say when we developed the EITC and the child credit scenarios, especially the lowest income EITC and the lowest income child credit, they look quite different. But they're essentially the same policy design. We're just pulling in the folks who are not eligible for the EITC because they don't have earned income, at least in that year. So consideration of bolstering family incomes when they have children is a potential, but there's a much larger effect of a child credit than of a low-income EITC, simply because there's quite a number of folks who are cut out from being eligible for the Cal EITC because they don't have earned income, at least not in that year. Wait for the mic.
Thank you. This has been an incredible presentation. I'm curious about some of what you know of the literature on sort of the returns to reductions in deep child poverty or child poverty in general. How do we think about these kinds of returns in relation to the costs of these kinds of programs?
That's a good point, and a difficult one. I think quite a lot of evidence from the federal EITC and the expansion of the EITC indicate that there are not just effects on, clearly effects on work among parents, but also health effects and educational effects in the positive direction. So that to consider the implications of adopting any new policies we would want to understand a range of effects and not just the effects on income. And we do today really focus just on the effects on income, but the potential for positive effects is much broader than that. I will also say that one of the reasons the EITC is a popular policy is because it does incentivize work. And when you drop that from the equation, then you need to seriously consider whether the potential incentive effects of not having of not needing to work in order to claim a credit. At the same time, I think some of the literature on child credits is starting to recognize that childbirth, or not just starting to recognize, but that childbirth and having a child is a significant expense and can be a significant source of instability, and so that it may be worth focusing on policies that can help to stabilize families at critical points in the life cycle, whether or not tied to earnings. Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any speculation as to how the federal tax plan could affect your policy suggestions.
Of the large-scale safety net programs that we have in place in California and in every state in the country, most of them are substantially supported with federal dollars. And so holes in the safety net created by federal policy changes would have, make it less possible for California to, we would be in the business of filling holes if we chose to do that rather than expanding the social safety net. That would be the direct effect of rating of policies. Whether the indirect effects of a tax plan that would create different kinds of incentives on the state, different pressures on the state budget. There could be other kinds of indirect
Consider
effects.
any of the proposals in these?
Not directly, no. Partly because we had completed the main research by the time they came out.
Thank you.
It's an important question. I mean, a key consideration for state policymaking is what's happening at the federal level.
A lot of the policy alternatives you mentioned would require people to file taxes in order to gain the benefit from them. The exception being minimum wage, which obviously could have tax implications as well. So I was wondering whether the probability that these folks would actually file tax returns was factored into the changes in poverty rates.
No, and that's a very good point. So this represents the sort of full-scale, full take-up expansion scenario where everyone did file taxes. And especially when you're not required to file taxes, there's a good amount of evidence that you might not actually be filing taxes. So claiming a credit that couldn't happen unless. At the same time, the EITC among safety net programs has one of the higher, the federal EITC anyways, has one of the higher take-up rates. So as a delivery mechanism for the safety net, it's not the worst one that we have by any stretch. But there is that limitation. This is a kind of optimistic scenario. It's coming.
Hi, this is really, really interesting study. Thank you. There have been studies that showed integrating income levels in housing have had an impact on poverty levels. So have you done anything to look at the renter's credit and, where there was integration or not in housing?
So no, this again is a sort of limitation of the research. We assume sort of no change except that you would have these additional resources. And clearly if there were major changes to housing policy, like a renter's credit, there could be resorting of folks of choosing a different place to live, perhaps a more mixed housing situation. But it's not something with the data we have available that we thought for this kind of overview project that we could really undertake with any reliability, so we didn't go there. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I invite you to take a look at our website and to explore the online resources, and please get in touch and let us know what you think and ask us questions. We're available.